Now, as we think about the small church, there are a number of characteristics that influence the church, that predominate in the church. Now, as we look at these characteristics, there's a number of them that we're going to look at. No church will manifest all the characteristics that we mentioned. Some will manifest more, some will manifest less. But as we look at the small church, oftentimes many of these will be present within the church, and they influence how we're going to do ministry and how we relate to the church. Because one of the mistakes that we make is that we assume that the principles that work in one context will work in another. But because the culture is different, the leadership must be different. Now, the primary focus of leadership, as we think about leadership in the church, ultimately, we want to be biblical in our leadership. That's foundational. There are certainly biblical principles that we see that are outlaid for leadership that are absolute regardless of culture. That it doesn't matter whether you're in a farming community, an urban community, whether you're in an American church or a Russian church or an African church, whatever that context might be, there are certain principles of leadership that are true regardless of culture. But there's also elements of leadership that are affected by culture. And that's what we want to look at. Because we want to understand that if we go into a church, what worked well in a urban context will not work well in a rural context. I know one pastor who came out of a larger church in an urban context and became a pastor of a small church. And so his only model, his only point of reference in terms of how to lead and how to do ministry was based upon that larger church context. And for the first couple of years, there was a lot of frustration on his part and on the part of the church because that was his reference and it wasn't working in his local situation. Why? Because there was two different contexts. And he needed to adapt his leadership to the new context. And so it's important that we understand how this small church thinks so that we can be effective in leading in the context of the small church. Now, the first thing that we find, and perhaps the single most important aspect of the small church that influences everything that we do within the context of the church, is that it is relationally driven. In the larger church, the focus oftentimes is upon programs. It's, in many ways, organizationally driven, so that the organization becomes predominant, so that decisions are based upon how it will influence and affect the organization. Programs are developed based upon, will it strengthen the organization or will it weaken the organization? But as we go into the small church context, it's relationally driven. There is a family atmosphere where each individual is considered part of the bigger family and where relationships become more important than performance in the organization. For example, imagine for a moment that you have an individual in the church who is the treasurer of the church. And this individual is, to put it nicely, is not equipped to be an effective treasurer. They don't handle money well. They're not organized. And so the finances of the church are starting to get all boggled up into a mess, and you as a leader have to do something. Now, if you were in a large church and you would gather together as a board, the conversation might go something like this. Well, if we leave this person in, how will it affect our economic health of the organization? And it's determined that the economic health will suffer, so as a result, we will remove that person. In essence, we will fire the person from the job and get someone in there who can be effective in that position. But now as we go into a rural setting, or a small church setting, where it's a strong relational-driven church, no longer is the question, how does it affect the organization? The question that will be asked at this board meeting will be, well, what will happen to Fred if we remove him from this job? How will he respond? How will it affect his attendance in the church? How will it affect his attitude to the church? How will it affect his family? And they may conclude that because it would hurt Fred to leave him in that position, or to remove him from that position, they will then leave him in that position and do other things to try to help him and help the church run in a business-like manner, but still have him in the job. Why? Because it's relationally driven. So that programs and the organizational structure are determined and monitored by the effect that it will have upon relationships. And anything that is perceived to be a threat to the unity of the church will oftentimes encounter strong opposition, even though it would benefit the church in terms of its growth. One of the things that I have found in many small churches is that oftentimes they're very reluctant to go to small groups and start meeting in small groups. And certainly there's been a strong push of the small group church or small group movement. But oftentimes when the pastor comes in, they've gone to a seminar of a larger church that says, that growth and evangelism has to happen in the context of small groups, and they come back and they say, okay, we want to establish 5 small groups within the church, and all of a sudden he gets in resistance and he doesn't understand why. Well, the reason is because from their perspective, by dividing the church up into small groups, they're creating cliques that will destroy the unity of the church. Now, I believe that small groups are very beneficial, even in the small church. But we have to think these things through and ask ourselves, how can we maintain and build the unity of the church, even in the midst of having them attend small group meetings? Why? Because the church is relationally driven. The second characteristic of many small churches is that they work through informal channels. Because of the strong relational bonds, decisions are made oftentimes over a cup of coffee rather than at a business meeting. When there is a formal decision that needs to be made, and so a formal meeting is called, oftentimes the purpose of that meeting is not to make the decision, but just to publicly ratify the decision that's already been made. Informally, over the cup of coffee, over the dinner table, as people have discussed it, over the phone lines, as people have talked about it. So as we think about goals and direction in the church, oftentimes, rather than setting them down in a written form, we need to verbalize them and communicate them informally. Policies oftentimes are best communicated informally rather than through handing someone a formal policy manual of the church and saying, here, read this if you're going to be a Sunday school teacher. And so as leaders, the challenge for us in terms of leading in the context of this informal structure is how do we operate and maintain some organizational integrity within the context of this informal structure. Because certainly we need organization. We need structure. We need a sense of what we need to do and why we need to do it. And sometimes a small church, because it operates informally, can kind of become loosey-goosey in terms of its organization. And so sometimes we have to challenge the church to be better organized, to be more efficient, to set goals, direction. We definitely need some policy manuals and some policy statements, even in the small church, on issues such as sexual misconduct or inappropriate behavior. But how do we do that in the context of this informal culture That's the challenge that we face. And again, the importance then is to communicate oftentimes informally, rather than just handing out a piece of paper at a congregational meeting and say, here is now our policy on Christian workers and our children workers. Rather, we may need to informally go to every one of the Christian workers, the children workers in the church, and informally sit them down and say, okay, here's the policy that we need to have in our church in terms of how we can protect individuals and protect children. A third characteristic of the small church, again, because it's a relationally driven church, it oftentimes works as a whole rather than as individual parts. It acts as a whole. It functions as a whole. So that the whole congregation makes decisions rather than a representative few. The larger the church, the more the decision making will be delegated to the representative few. But the smaller the church, the more it will be made on a congregational level. So that the small church really functions as a participatory democracy where everyone has a voice and everyone wants to have their voice heard. So even when the vote is perfunctory, it's still people want a vote. They require a vote to make that. And even individuals who are not directly affected by a decision want to have a say in that decision. Now, as we think about that in the small church, and as we think about everyone having a voice, it's also important for us to understand that in the small church, not every voice is of equal weight in the small church. And this takes us back to this whole issue of the power brokers within the church. That there are individuals within the small church that have significant influence. They are the power brokers. They are the tribal chiefs, if you would, of that congregation. And what they say has significant sway over the decision and direction of the church. Now, it's important for us to understand why they are there. Oftentimes, what happens in ministry is that pastors feel threatened by these power brokers. And so they go in and they try to challenge their authority, or they try to rip authority from them and bring it to themselves. And what they don't realize is that by doing that, they lose any basis of authority or influence in the church. But we need to understand why these individuals are power brokers. One of the reasons they're power brokers is because, again, going back to that group dynamic, that they are the natural leaders in the church. That these individuals have become leaders in the church because of their past history. They have earned the trust of people. And we cannot assume as pastors that just because we have a position of leadership that we automatically earn the trust of people. One of the problems that the small church has faced over the years is short-term pastorates. That individuals come in, they're using the small church as a stepping stone onto a larger church ministry perhaps. And as a result, that the average stay in a small church may be as little as 1 to 2 years. Well, as a result of that, the people have learned that the stability of the church in terms of its leadership is not found in the pastoral position, but is found in the lay leadership. Because these are the individuals who keep the church together through all these transitions of leadership on a pastoral level. So as a result of that, they naturally begin to look to these lay leaders as the individuals who can give continuity to the church. We need to understand that. So we need to ask ourselves, who are these power brokers? Myers points out, who leads whom is one of the most crucial problems that must be worked out when one enters a new society. People are led most effectively by their natural leaders. And so if we translate that from from a cultural perspective to a church perspective, what he's saying is this, that who is the power brokers in the church is one of the most critical things we need to identify as we go into the church. And we must not be threatened by them, but we must recognize that they play an important position within that church, that they are the natural leaders, and people will be best led by them. And so we need to learn to work with them rather than try to undermine them. Because if we try to undermine them, if we try to circumvent their authority, we will inevitably lose. And so it's imperative to us as pastoral leaders that we learn to work with them and influence them. We need to strengthen them. We need to encourage them. It's one of the ways this becomes most evident in terms of the church is in the direction, the area of vision and direction for the church. In the large church, the pastor is seen as the visionary. He is the one that people look to determine the vision and the direction of the church. But in the small church, because it's relationally driven, because it works as a whole, the vision and direction must come from the context of the congregation. So the pastor's role is not so much to be the visionary as he is to be the facilitator of the vision. He is to be the one who comes alongside the church and helps the church assess where it needs to go, and then helps the church attain that direction. A fourth characteristic of the church is that power and authority reside in the laity. Again, the small church is owned and operated by the laity rather than the pastor. We have the title. We have the position, but we do not necessarily have the authority in the church. We need to understand that, and we need to earn the right to have that trust. And how do we do that? Well, that takes time. It takes time to build relationships, to start building the trust so that if people look at us, they start trusting our leadership. And the more they trust our leadership, the more they'll follow our leadership. But that doesn't happen overnight. And that's why the tragedy is oftentimes pastors leave far too soon before they've had an opportunity to start building that trust to people. The moment we start demanding authority, we will lose all authority. Authority can only happen when we start building trust so that people realize we're not out for authority, but we're out to help them in their life and ministry. A fifth characteristic is that the small church relates as a family. As we think about a family, imagine for a moment that you are adopting a child. You don't just bring a child in and says, okay, this child is now part of our family. But rather, the child must be grafted in. They must be adopted into the family. And that takes time to develop. And that's true in the church. That one of the strengths of the small church is its family atmosphere. It's a hard place to get out of. Once you're in the small church, it's hard to leave this church because there's such a strong pull from the family. But one of the weaknesses of that is oftentimes it's difficult to break into the church because the new person needs to be grafted in. They need to be adopted into the family. They need to build relationships. And that takes time. And it's not that the small church is intentionally trying to keep people from joining them. They want people to join their church. But in the small church, what happens is, and I liken it to a Lego block, that imagine for a moment you have a Lego block, and we all know the Lego block, that on this Lego block there's all kinds of little spots you can connect other Legos to. And depending on the size of that block is how many relationships that you can have. Well, each one of us are like a Lego block. Each one of us have a certain number of relationships that we can have and enjoy. Some of us may be a two-spot Lego person. We just want a few relationships. Some of us may be a large Lego block. We can fit a lot of relationships in. But the point is that once our Lego block is filled with all the connections, we no longer have a desire to go out and build any new relationships. Well, in the small church, because it's so strong relationally, people have their Lego blocks, if you would, already full. So when a new person comes into the church, they're trying to find a place to connect, a place to build a relationship with, but it's difficult because people will be friendly, but they're already enjoying their friendships with other people. And so sometimes it takes, on our part, being intentional to challenge people that for a time, maybe we need to empty one of our Lego places so we can build a relationship with a new person. But as we think about adapting into the culture or adapting into the church, part of that is adapting the culture. As we think about the church has cultural expectations that it has. And a new person coming in will need to adapt to that cultural expectation. How they dress, how they think, how they act, in order to become part of that new church. But that's also true of us as we go in. That as pastors, when we come into a church, we need to recognize that we're coming into a family and we need to start building relationships. We need to start spending time to strengthen those relationships. And we need to recognize that there's going to be differences in this new group. And we need to start setting aside our differences and adapt to their culture if we want to be grafted in to the church family. A sixth characteristic of the small church is that the small church communicates through the grapevine. Now, every church, every congregation will have ways in which it communicates, ways in which it disseminates information. In some churches, this may be through a very formal type of communication, through newsletters, through meetings, through congregational meetings, through official pastoral letters. They may be very formal. In others, in the small church, oftentimes it's informally, that it communicates on an informal basis. Everyone in the small church knows what's going on because everyone talks about it. The grapevine is very effective in the small church in disseminating information. In fact, the rule of thumb is the smaller the church, the more the grapevine will be an asset to the church. The larger the church, the more it will be a liability in terms of information. Now, positively, this means that everyone knows what's going on because everybody talks about it. What is communicated oftentimes privately will be publicized as people talk over a phone, as they talk over a cup of coffee, as they talk about the ministry, as they talk about the church. Negatively, and this is where it becomes a drawback, oftentimes people will find out about things even before the leadership is ready for them to know about it. I don't know how many times we go into a board meeting and we talk about an important issue and we emphasize, we do not want this to be taken outside the board meeting. All of them agree it won't. But within a matter of a couple of weeks, everybody in the church knows about it. None of the board say they talked about it. None of them said that they shared, but eventually everybody in the congregation knows because of the grapevine. Now, what this means is that in terms of our leadership, we need to have a greater stress upon communication. It's far better to over-communicate than it is to under-communicate. That we need to share. We need to be open with people. We need to communicate often and in many different ways to people so that they know what's going on, so that the right information is being shared, and there's nothing hidden in the church. A seventh characteristic is that traditions and heritage undergird the structures, ministry, and culture of the church. Within the small church, traditions are more than just ruts. Now, oftentimes the criticism of the small church is that they are traditional and unwilling to change. That's really not true. But we need to understand that the reason they are tied to traditions is not because they're unwilling to change, but because the traditions and the heritage is what connects the present generation to the previous generation. Again, going back to the fact it's relationally driven. And as a result of that, the stories that people share, the bonds that people have, even things within the church are relational connectors, not only from the people presently in the church, but also from the previous people who used to attend the church and now have gone to be with the Lord. There are a number of individuals who have had a significant influence in the church, in the formation of the spirituality of people that are no longer present in the church, and yet their memory remains oftentimes in the traditions or in the heritage of the church. For example, the church I grew up in, there is a huge pulpit. And traditional wisdom or contemporary wisdom would say that would be a liability, that today in terms of public speaking we want a very small pulpit, even just a stand that you can move around and identify with the people. And yet in this church there is this huge pulpit. But it's a very beautiful pulpit. It's very beautifully crafted by master workmen. Now, if a stranger walked into the church and knowing nothing of the church, he would see that large pulpit, and even though it's very beautiful, would say, that pulpit, it's time for it to go. That was a very beautiful pulpit back in the 50s, but we need to modernize the church a little bit. But what they don't realize is they would encounter a number of people in strong opposition, not because of the pulpit, but because George Dorman and Vern Mitchell are the ones that made that pulpit. And George and Vern were individuals who were very gifted craftsmen in woodworking, and they had a deep love for the Lord. And so the way they expressed their love to the Lord was through the building of many of the different church furniture that one sees not only in the pulpit, but in the coat closet and the narthex, and a number of different areas in the church. And so to go in there and remove that pulpit would be to remove the identity that people have with George and Vern. And so the issue here is not a legalistic issue. It's not a unwilling to change, but it's the fact that is the connection between the present generation and the previous generation. One church I was pastoring, we had some very uncomfortable pews, very small seats and very straight backs that were very uncomfortable for anyone sitting there. And so another church near the area replaced their pews with chairs, and so they gave these padded pews to this church. And as we talked about bringing in the new pews and replacing the old pews, one of the ladies, who was a very elderly lady, made this statement. She said, "My father was the one who brought these old pews into the church. You see, now I know we have a problem. This is not an issue of the pews. It's an issue, if we remove those pews, she is going to lose a relational connection with her father. And so if we are to change the pews, the one thing we have to do is think through, how can we, in the changing of the pews, bring the relational connection for her and the church to this individual who has long since passed away. You see, that's what we mean when we say traditions and heritage undergird the structure. It's because of that relational connection. And so individuals who come into the church, new individuals need to learn the stories. As pastors, as we go into a church, the first thing we want to do is start learning the stories. Learning to hear what are the stories, what are their traditions, and why are they important? What's the story behind the furniture? What's the story behind the way they do things? Because it will not only tell us much about the present church, it will tell us about relationships within the church. And before we can start making effective changes, we need to know those relationships. We need to know what are things that we should not change because it would destroy relationships and relational connections. And what are the things that we can change in the church. Traditions and heritage undergird oftentimes the ministry in the small church. An eighth characteristic is that the church functions and worships intergenerationally. Because they are a family, they want to be together as a family. And to divide the church or split the church by age is to split the family. People in the small church do not only enjoy being together, but they enjoy being together with the different generations, the different age groups. They don't want to be segregated. And while we can segregate them for Sunday school and perhaps even a junior church, but they still want times when they're together as a family. They don't mind babies crying in the back row because that's part of the family. That's part of who they are. And this is in contrast to our secular culture. Our secular culture wants to segregate generations so that each generation is competing with the other. In a small church, oftentimes each generation looks out for the interests of others. They value one another. And it's part of how the church functions. A ninth characteristic, and again this goes back to relationships, is that people are more important than performance. In the business model of management, people are measured by the way they perform their job. If they do their job well, they're kept in that position. If they struggle in the job, if they're not doing that job well, they're oftentimes removed. But in the small church, the focus shifts to the individual person. So that if the person is failing to do their job, what happens is oftentimes others will very quietly go about doing it for them. And so they come and they complain to the pastor that so-and-so is not doing their job well, and so the pastor hears all these complaints, so the pastor thinks, well, we need to remove this person. But as soon as they start the process of removing that person, all of a sudden they encounter opposition from the very people that were complaining about it. Why? Because they didn't want to hurt that person. And so they stress the people over performance. And so consequently, we're going to talk more about this in terms of, as we, later on in one of the sessions, as we talk about management by relationships. We often hear today in terms of management courses or books, management by objectives. Well, in the small church, you need to manage by relationships, where you develop relationships and minister to individuals on a relational basis. And we're going to talk and we're going to devote a specific segment to this to talk about how do we do that in the small church? How do we lead the small church on a relational basis? A 10th characteristic of the small church, it has a place for everyone. Whether it's someone who is not able to do very much and so they're put in charge of the sound system. Or perhaps it's a retired grandmother who teaches an adult Sunday school class. Everyone has an opportunity to be involved. And it's not based upon their skill, it's based upon what they can do. They may not be particularly gifted individuals. For example, oftentimes in special music, people who are asked to conduct special music in a small church oftentimes may not be gifted singers, but they wanted to sing, and so people want to give them that opportunity to sing, even though they don't sing well. Because the small church, one of the reasons why the small church operates this way is it has the premise that involving people is a way of including people. And so they will involve people as a way to try to get them included in the church. Sometimes they will involve people even when that person is not faithful. For example, someone in a leadership position in a large church earns the right to be in that leadership position based upon their past faithfulness. They've been given some minor jobs, and as they've been faithful there, they've given more and more responsibility, and if they prove themselves faithful, then they obtain a position of leadership. In the small church, sometimes they operate this way. Well, George has not been attending church lately. I tell you what, let's make him Sunday school superintendent, and maybe he'll start coming more. Now, oftentimes this can lead to significant problems in the church, but this is just how the small church oftentimes thinks. A second reason is that they have an intense desire to have everybody involved because that's part of family responsibility. Just as in a family, everyone has chores to do. The small church operates with this same mindset. Everyone has a responsibility as part of the family. So they have a place for everyone in terms of ministry. 11th characteristic, oftentimes of small churches, is that they value relatives. Because oftentimes bloodlines are very important, relatives and who's related to who plays a significant role within the dynamics of the church and how they relate to one another. For example, an individual has been on the board for a number of years and finally he wants to step down. And so the church then, as they look at the people available to take that position on the board, will automatically assign it to that person's son because, well, that was kind of his dad's job and now it's time he took over that responsibility. And so bloodlines are important. Relationships are important. And who influences who. The small church values generalists rather than the specialists. The larger the church, the more the person needs to be a specialist. They want a person who's very gifted with children to work with children. But in the small church, they want a person, rather than who can do one thing well, they want a person who can do multiple things in the church. They'd rather have someone who can do 3 or 4 tasks than do one job in a very high degree of effectiveness. They want someone who not only as a pastor is a good teacher, they want someone who can be an effective youth director, a song leader, a caretaker of the church property. And so one of the problems that we face, I believe, in our educational system is that as we've gone through Bible college or seminary, oftentimes we are specialized in the educational process. And so we have different degrees of specialization. We have a degree in Old Testament specialization, New Testament specialization, a degree in theology that specializes in theology, or one of practical ministry, a pastoral ministry, or another specialization in youth ministry. But the problem is when we come out of seminary, then we go into a small church, what we find is they don't want that person who's just a specialist in the Old Testament or just a specialist in preaching. They want a person who can do a number of different responsibilities. And so as we try to specialize, they're trying to get us to become more generalists, and we become frustrated. And so we need to recognize that in a small church, because of the limited personnel to do the number of different jobs, they want someone who can do a number of jobs rather than just one specific task. The small church has a place for everyone, and everyone has a place. Now, what do I mean by that? few years ago, in the church I was pastoring, we had one husband and wife. They were a retired couple. They always sat right over here, about 2 rows up, right next to the center aisle. That's where they sat every Sunday. Sunday after Sunday, you could count. If that spot was not filled by them, it's because they were gone. Well, they moved. And they moved to a town about 40 miles down the road, so they no longer attended the church. And it was interesting. No one else sat in that position. That for 4 years, that spot was empty. Except for maybe if there was an occasional visitor or someone who came in, they might sit there. But as far as the regular people, no one would sit in that position. As it happened, about 4 years later, the couple moved back into the community and started coming to the church. Guess where they sat? Right in the same place. And that's true in the small church. That people have a place. That everyone has a place that they sit. A place that is their territory, if you would. Why? Because it's a family. And as you think about a family, as you sit down at the family dinner table, it's not musical chairs. Everyone has a place they sit in every Sunday. Or at every meal, they sit at the same place. And that's true in the church. Everyone has a place that they sit in. And it's interesting, sometimes that place can determine status within the church. As I was growing up, as I think about the small church I attended, there was 3 rows of pews. On this side is where the teenagers sat. In the middle is where the middle-aged people had. In the kind of the back was the back rows of the middle that's where the people with young children sat, so that if the child started crying, they would remove them from the service and come back in and sit down. And then over on this side is where the retired people sat. And it was interesting that as a person changed in their age, they would change positions. I remember as a young child thinking, boy, I can't wait till I get to sit over on this side. And so then when you became a high schooler, and it wasn't a formal thing, it was nothing spoken, it was just now you were trusted to sit by yourself. And so you'd go and you'd sit over here with the kids. And as people grew up and their families moved on, they would just kind of naturally shift over to the other grouping over here on this side of the retired people. And so the place that everyone had also had an indication of their grouping within the church. That's oftentimes true because it relates as a family, it functions as a family. And so it's a place that symbolizes their position, not only in the church but in society. It's a place of security that they have. This is our place at the church. This is where we sit every Sunday. Another characteristic of oftentimes the small churches is they have a different calendar and timetable. Now this will depend somewhat upon the setting. If you're in an agricultural community, the timetable or the calendar of the church will reflect the calendar of farming. For example, if you're in a farming community, you don't want to plan any major church events in the months of May and June, because those are spring planting, April, May, and June, or perhaps in July or August you don't want to do anything because those are times of harvest. If you want to have something that a special missionary conference or a special event, you would plan it in the wintertime. Why? Because that's when the farmers are not busy and they're available to come. If you're in a ranching community, you don't want to plan activities in the months of February. Why? Because those are calving season. And that's when the men are having to oftentimes stay home from church and they can't come out in the evenings because they're having to take care of their cattle and their calves. If you're in a logging community, it may be revolving around the logging cycle, where some of the winter months are some of the busiest because that's when they can get out in the woods. And then in the summertime, when they're having the slowdowns because of fire danger, then is when you can plan activities. So the calendar of the church becomes reflective of the calendar of the community. It also can revolve around key community events. For example, the fair. In the community that I pastored for a number of years, it didn't take long to realize that you don't plan things in the month of August. Why? Because that's the time everybody's getting ready for the fair. And so that was the time you had to kind of lighten the load for everybody so they could do their fair activities. So what is the calendar? What is the timetable of the church? And then lastly, in the small church, people are givers. One of the strengths of the small church is that they have a strong sense of ownership in the ministry, and they will give to the ministry. But the thing about the small church oftentimes is they do not give to a budget, they give to a need. And as a result of that, oftentimes they'll sit down every year and they'll formulate a budget, but that'll be the last time they look at the budget for the next year. Why? Because when it comes to the daily operations, they just look at what is the need of today. We have a need to re-roof the church. Okay, let's have a special offering, and everybody gives to the church for that special need. But if you tried to put that in the budget and say we want to put in $2,000 every year for maintenance, people wouldn't give to that. Why? Because there's not a need for it. And so as a result of that, and what we need to understand as pastors is that the small church from the outside always seems to be on the edge financially. It never has a lot in the bank. It never has an excess amount of funds. It's always just kind of right on the edge. But whenever it crosses the edge and things get tight, or there's an emergency or there's a need, then all of a sudden the money's there and it gets taken care of until the next crisis. Because that's how people give. People give to needs rather than the organization, to a budget. So the church never really becomes, in a sense, fully solvent, although it always seems to pay all the bills and it survives quite well. And so we don't need to worry when the budget's tight and things look real bleak. Just communicate that to people. And they will give generously then to the need. Because the small church people are givers.